Hey everybody, it's Mike here from The Art of Guitar. You're gonna have to excuse my shirt. I usually don't like to wear the same shirt as the topic of my video unless it's a concert review, but my singer was gonna come in today. We're gonna do a whole nother video, but he had to cancel at the last minute. So I thought I would do this OZZY video, and it just happens that I'm wearing this shirt. After I watched the final Black Sabbath concert and then Ozzy passed away, I started to realize that there's a whole bunch of stuff I didn't know about both Ozzy Osbourne or Sabbath. I mean, I grew up with them, but that doesn't mean you know all the behind the scenes details. So I decided to do a little deep dive. I started watching, the Osbournes. I started listening to all the Sabbath albums in order. And then I also picked up Ozzy's Autobiography from 2009. And there's a whole bunch of stuff in that book that just blew my mind. So I thought I would talk about those bullet points today. I'm not going to go through the whole book. There's so much more that I'm not going to talk about, so it's worth checking out. But I'm going to basically tell you about the things that surprised me, or just, the things that just kind of shocked me. Early on in the book, it talks about how Ozzy's dad, Jack, told him that, you're going to do one of two things. You're either going to do something big or you're going to end up in prison. And he was actually right about both things, because Ozzy ended up in the slammer before his 18th birthday for stealing clothes. He could have just paid a fine to get out of prison time, but his dad refused to do it because he thought it would teach Ozzy a good lesson. The way Ozzy describes his schooling experience reminds me of a Pink Floyd video. He talks about a teacher named Mr. Jones who used to beat him with a shoe. So he would actually make Ozzy go to the back of the class and choose the biggest shoe on the rack. And if he didn't choose the biggest one, the teacher would actually beat him twice as much after he went back himself to grab the biggest shoe. After all that school business, he decided he has to work at a factory because that was really the only choice for them back then. So he worked a few jobs that he hated, and so he decided, you know what, I'm gonna try to get into the music business. So I guess he used to walk around with an empty guitar case that had a sticker on it that said the Black Panthers. I thought that was kind of funny because he would eventually obviously end up in Black Sabbath, but here it said the Black Panthers. A little bit of foreshadowing going on there. And then I guess he was desperate, so he went to work at a slaughterhouse. And he had to do some really grisly stuff in that job, like, picking up the puke. You can imagine, using the bolt gun on the cows. And it just sounded nasty. And this was his start of a long line of crazy animal encounters that we will talk about coming up. He ended up putting up a flyer that said Ozzy Zig needs a gig. And I guess Geezer Butler saw that and asked him if he would join his band called Rare Breed because they needed a singer. And I think Ozzy only got the gig because his dad bought him a PA system, which is huge. If you're a vocalist and you don't have a PA system, you're going to lose out to the guy who actually has the equipment, unless you're like Steve Perry or something, And that's a really curious thing that his dad, who was really poor, ended up taking out a loan, I guess, to buy Ozzy a PA system. So he must have had some sort of sixth sense about this or something, that he knew Ozzy was going to do something big with it. Well, it turns out Rare Breed played one gig after Ozzy joined, and it was so bad that they just decided to call it. It wasn't the end of the world for Geezer because I guess he was an accountant or something like that. Like, he was real smart, and he could have easily had a future doing a desk job of some kind. But Ozzy was pretty bummed because he didn't really have anywhere to go from here, so he was just resigning himself to go back to just a regular factory job. You wouldn't believe the power of flyers back then. It's kind of like putting an ad in the paper from Metallica, how they found each other. Well, this flyer that Ozzy put out, the Ozzy Zig needs a gig, ended up attracting Tony Iommi and Bill Ward to his front door. And so they're like, hey, I saw your ad that you're a singer. And then Tony recognized Ozzy because they had gone to school together a while back. They were a year apart. Tony was older. But when he recognized Ozzy, he's like, nope, I'm not going to be in a band with this class clown. But somehow Ozzy talked him into it. Ozzy's really good with his personality. I think that's why he got really far, just because people like Ozzy, Tony and Bill's band was called Mythology, and I guess they were a pretty big deal. Mythology had to break up eventually because they got a bad reputation because of some drug bust that happened. And so they were kind of not sure what to do. They ended up getting Geezer Butler and starting a new band. And at the time, Geezer wasn't even a bass player. He played guitar. So at their first band practice, it turns out he played a Telecaster. But obviously, we all know what happens later. He becomes this insane bass player. And Tony said he just seemed like a natural. He just picked it up right away. Now, the band did not have a name yet. And Ozzy said he was going to go to a special place where he comes up with ideas, which happened to be the toilet. And he saw some sort of talcum powder or something that his mom used on her armpits, and he came up with the name Polka Tulk blues band. He thought that would be great, and they just went with it. It's funny because they were such a heavy band eventually, but their first band name was Polka Toke. It's like the word polka was in their name. It's so wild. They eventually changed the name to Earth. And when I think Bill brought up the name, they laughed at him because they thought the word itself just sounded like you were throwing up. So Ozzy's like, "Are you okay, man? It sounded like you just threw up." He's like, "No, the band name is Earth." And Ozzy just couldn't let that go, but they eventually went with it. I guess they played pranks on Bill all the time, as well as each other, but mostly on Bill. And you'll learn that whenever there's a group of any kind, there's always one member that takes the brunt of the gags, it seems like. In our band, it was our bass player. Sorry, Corey, for all that. But in this band, it was Bill Ward. And I guess one time they were recording and they would just kind of, piss off the side of a patio of some kind. And one time Tony was there with a blue spray paint can and he decided to spray paint Bill's private parts as he went to the bathroom. And it actually caused Bill to faint, fall over the edge, and roll down the hill, supposedly, because I think it was toxic. Another time in a studio, I guess they took some sort of chemical that they were using to clean the head cleaners at the studio, and they poured it on Bill and lit him on fire. That really blew me away. I'm like, they actually lit their drummer on fire. And I guess to this day, he has burn marks on his body. So now they had the band name Earth, and they were trying to get gigs. And I believe it was Tony who had this plan that whenever a big band would come to town, they would pack up their van full of their gear, and they would all go to the show just in case the headlining band had to cancel for some reason or just didn't show up. It sounds like a crazy plan, but I guess it worked one time. Jethro Tull was supposed to be at this concert and they couldn't make it. So Earth ended up taking their spot for the show and they did really well. And so that was their big break into the business. And I believe one member from Jethro Tull ended up showing up at the gig because he was going to go there to apologize for not being able to make it. I think their van broke down or something. So he ended up seeing Earth play. And so he was very interested in mostly Tony Iommi. Well, things were really taking off for Earth now, but Tony had some bad news for the band. He's like, Jethro Tull called and asked if I would join their band. And I said yes. So it turns out that he joined Jethro Tull for one show. And then after 4 days, he just quit because he decided he didn't want to be working for somebody. He'd rather have his own thing. So Earth was once again a band. They found out there was another band called Earth. Tony was like, I'm back, but we have to get serious now. So we have to change our name. We have to practice all the time. We have to do it for real. So I guess they played a place called Star Club in Hamburg, Germany, and they would play like all day from 12 noon to 2 in the morning, they said. And this is a reoccurring pattern for a lot of the greatest bands in history. They always had a certain time period where they had to play all the time. And that's kind of where they sharpen their skills. They cut their teeth during that time, kind of like the Beatles did as well. But people said that they actually played more than the Beatles had to in Hamburg. I guess they were so broke that what they would do is they would sort of use Tony as a honey trap. And while Tony would distract one of the groupies, Ozzy said that he would crawl on his hands and knees like an army guy, and he would reach into the girl's purse and steal money. He said he wasn't proud of it, but that's how desperate they were back then. I cracked up so hard picturing Ozzy like, army crawling it across the floor as Tony is on the bed right next to them, like getting it on with a groupie. Well, they realized they needed to record something, some kind of single, so they actually chose the song Evil Woman by a band called Crow, and they're actually from my home state of Minnesota, so I thought that was pretty cool. Not Evil Woman by ELO, but the Crow version. And if you listen to it, it's actually a pretty good recording. It got them on the radio, and I think they only played them like once, but Ozzy said he was running around the house all excited, and sadly his mom was just like, keep it down, keep it down. And there's a reoccurring thread through this entire book that Ozzy always seemed to want his parents to be proud of him, and they never really showed that they were until it was pretty much too late. But he kind of lives with that feeling that his parents were never truly proud of him for the reasons he wanted them to be. So eventually they end up recording Black Sabbath, and it's this huge hit, surprise hit for them. They recorded it in like one day. They said they just basically jammed like they were playing a concert, and then they did some overdubs, and that was it. So they recorded it that fast. It really shocked me how disconnected Ozzy made the whole satanic thing seem to the band, because I thought somebody in the band had to dabble in some sort of, occult, kind of like Led Zeppelin with Jimmy Page. But I thought maybe Geezer did or something like that, but according to Ozzy, they sent off the album and it came back with all the artwork done and the upside down cross, and he made it sound like they had nothing really to do with that. He even acted like they were annoyed by the fans that were into the occult and Satanism and stuff. And that one time, on stage, this guy in a cloak ran up, and I guess the roadie had to take the guy out. I think he hit him with a mic stand or something. And Ozzy's like, "What did you do that for? That's one of our fans." And he's like, "Look," and the guy had like a dagger inside of his cloak in his right hand. So it got pretty weird, but Ozzy really made it seem like they were disconnected from all that stuff, if not annoyed by it. I was surprised to find out that Paranoid, one of their biggest songs, if not their biggest song, was just a track that they threw together at the last minute when they were recording the album because they needed filler for the album. And Ozzy made a good point about that's usually when really great stuff comes out, because you're not really overthinking it. It just kind of came out naturally, and it ended up being I think their first big hit. It was short enough to be on the radio and be a single, because a lot of their other songs kind of go on a little bit and they change tempos and, they're pretty artistic. But Paranoid's pretty much straight ahead. Ozzy talks a lot about how he regrets how he treated his first wife, Thelma. And he said that it was probably a mistake to marry her in the first place. He just thought that's what you did back then. And so he has this wife and she has a son. Ozzy eventually adopted the kid. And, he was off doing all this stuff with the band, being crazy. And meanwhile, his wife was kind of holding down the fort. So that is a common thing through this book. He talks about the regret of how he treated Thelma and the kids, and even Sharon at times. It seemed like Ozzy wanted to stay a kid, stay a teenager. And so whenever adult things would happen in his life, he would sort of freak out. Like when Thelma's water broke for their first kid, Jessica, together. He was drinking like he always is. Throughout this whole book, by the way, that's another common thread. He's always on something. But instead of saying, "Oh no, I'm too drunk to handle this," he said, "Oh no, I'm not drunk enough to handle this." He could barely drive the car to get her to the hospital. And so that's just kind of funny to imagine Ozzy trying to do all this grown-up stuff while he's still really mentally a teenager and living the rock star life. I guess they were at a hotel one time and he was hanging out with Bill Ward, and Bill's like, "Oh, it's so hot in here," So he tried to turn on the air conditioner, but instead he tripped the emergency switch at the hotel. And suddenly all these cops came, and Ozzy freaked out because they had all this, cocaine and weed everywhere. So he ran off to the bathroom with someone else, and he and this guy had to basically ingest all the drugs because he thought, "Oh no, we can't just throw it all away." It ended up being a false alarm, obviously, but they didn't know that. So they basically did, he said 6 or 7 grams each. And I think that's enough to kill a small horse. He often talks about how much they got screwed by their management. And when you hear the stories, it's pretty crazy, because when things were really taking off, their first 4 albums were just selling huge. Their manager basically wouldn't give them like royalty checks. He didn't even have bank accounts for them. So what he would do is he would just wait for somebody in the band to call him and ask him for something, and he would just send it to them. So it was kind of like this Amazon service for the band at all times. So Ozzy would order cars, he would order pets. He ordered this gigantic 7-foot bear, I think, stuffed bear, that he later shot the head off with one of his guns that he ordered through his manager. So when all the smoke cleared after all the craziness, they found out all this, management business stuff, and it just basically screwed them for a long time. But I thought that was really weird that Geezer allowed this to happen, because like I said earlier, he was sort of this accountant type of mind. That's the job I believe he was going into if he wasn't in Sabbath. So it's weird that he didn't keep better track of all that kind of stuff. They chose to write and record Sabbath Bloody Sabbath in a haunted castle. So I thought it was really funny that the band Black Sabbath were scared out of their minds to record at this place. They said they couldn't get any sleep. They were constantly worried about noises and crazy ghost stories and all that stuff. If anything, you'd think they would embrace it, just use it for their music. But they were so freaked out, they eventually had to go to another studio to finish the album. This is pretty wild, but they had already released 4 awesome albums that sold really well. But Ozzy still felt the imposter syndrome the whole time. He kept saying that, "Man, I feel like any day now they're going to catch on to our little game and we're going to be exposed." And that just goes to show you, no matter how big you get, there's still part of you that wonders, is this just all temporary? Do I even belong here? So I guess Ozzy suffered for that for a long time, if not throughout his whole career. After hearing this next story, I felt better about my old band, because we used to do this quite a bit. Tony started telling Ozzy during Technical Ecstasy, it's one of their less popular albums, he was like, "You know what? I think we have to change a little bit and sound more like Queen, or we need to sound a little bit more like Foreigner." Ozzy was kind of shocked because he's like, "You know what? we used to be the band that influenced everybody. And now, for some reason, we're influenced by all these other bands. And if you listen to Technical Ecstasy, you can kind of tell they were sort of trying a whole bunch of stuff. It felt like they were trying to, figure out their sound again for some reason. Bands get to this point where they're like, we can't keep doing the same thing. And sometimes they change too much. I think that's what happened for this album. There's a whole section where Ozzy talks about the passing of his father. And it's a really strange foreshadowing because Jack, his dad, passed away after he retired. And after he finished his garden, he said that was his big goal. And then he passed away shortly after that. And then I thought about how Ozzy passed on. And it's like, you know what? He held on. This is what Tony Iommi said. For that last show, for the final farewell, the Back to the Beginning concert. And then a few weeks after that, he passed away. So it's pretty crazy to think about the parallels between his dad and himself when it comes to that. Ozzy was searching for a guitar player to be in his solo group. And at first, I think he was going to call the band The Blizzard of Oz. And there's a whole story behind that I'll get into in another video. But he was looking for a guitar player. And I guess it was Dana Strum who recommended Randy Rhoads. I grew up knowing Dana Strum from Slaughter. It was the first band I ever saw live. But he was one of those guys that was in a lot of bands. One of them was Vinnie Vincent Invasion, actually. And according to Ozzy, he hired Randy Rhoads after just hearing him warm up on the guitar. So I guess Randy was doing some finger exercises, and Ozzy's like, stop. And Randy's like, what? What's up? He's like, you're hired. Now, when you go through this book, you start to really realize the role that Sharon played in Ozzy's life. And you start to realize that if Sharon wasn't there, Ozzy, number one, probably wouldn't have lived nearly as long as he did. And second of all, I don't think his career would have taken off past maybe the first, phase. I'm not sure. You never know, but it really sounds like Sharon was the driving force for a lot of it. Ozzy said that he was just too much of a pushover. So those kind of people need a real strong figure to be partnered up with in order to go far. Ozzy's like, if it wasn't for Sharon, I probably would have just rolled over in every negotiation because he doesn't really like to fight. He doesn't like the business side of stuff. And so Sharon was great when it came to that side of things. This was really interesting. He said that he always felt insecure, like I talked about earlier. But a big reason for that was because he didn't play an instrument. He felt like he was just the singer, so he didn't really have a lot of leverage when it came to negotiations. I didn't realize how long Ozzy was seeing Sharon while he was still married to Thelma. So I guess that went on for a while. And then Ozzy told Thelma all the news, but he broke her the news on Christmas. So I thought that was bad timing, man. I never knew all that. I thought he, divorced Thelma and then met Sharon. I had no idea there was that much crossover. Ozzy said that Sharon was a lot like him, so they would get some crazy ideas together. And I guess in order to be memorable, that's my guess, they decided to bring 2 doves to this record company meeting. And I guess the plan was to throw the doves in the air when they walked in and have them fly while Ozzy screamed rock and roll. That definitely would have been memorable for sure. But what ended up happening was they started talking about really boring stuff. Ozzy was going crazy. Like I said, he hated all that stuff, that side of music. So he just decided to take one of the doves and bite its head off right there on the table. I never knew this. I knew the bat story, and how he talks about he picked up the bat. He thought it was like a fake bat. He bit the head off and had to get rabies shots. I knew about that, but I had no idea he voluntarily bit the head off of a dove at a business meeting. Jeez. I hate to laugh because I love birds, but just the thought of it is just so wild. During the Blizzard of Oz tour, I guess they used to catapult raw meat into the audience. I don't know who came up with that idea, probably Ozzy. He said that at one show, whoever was in charge of the catapult screwed up and pulled it back and locked it too early, so it was sitting like that all day. So the wire became kind of loose or something. So when they went to eject the catapult, it didn't have enough strength to throw the meat into the audience, so it ended up landing all over the stage, mostly on Ozzy. I remember watching the Osbournes and seeing Sharon's dad in it. His name's Dom. And they didn't really talk too much about their relationship, but I knew they had some, struggles between them. It turns out that the guy was pretty harsh. If you get to know the story, you're like, how did she ever talk to him after all that stuff? Well, originally Ozzy was with Dom's label, but after Ozzy and Sharon got together, they kind of pulled away from that label and they kind of had their own thing going on. So Sharon's own dad would call Ozzy into a meeting and badmouth Sharon and say all these terrible things about her that may or may not have been true to try to get them to separate so that he could get Ozzy back onto his label. I just thought of how dark that was, that her own father would try to do that for business. business reasons. But in the end, he got dementia, and if you watch the episode on the Osbournes, they brought him back into their home and until he passed away. So some people have a lot of forgiveness in them. It's good to know, actually. There's a lot of crazy stories about his tour with Motley Crue. I'm sure people have heard some of the stories before, but one of them was him peeing on the Alamo. And then one time he relieved himself on a car. It turned out to be an undercover cop's car. And then one time he said that he partied so hard he woke up and he was in the middle of a 12-lane highway. And could you imagine waking up and just seeing cars flying by you? And then he had to figure out where he was, and that's when he relieved himself on the cop car, I guess. I could be getting some of these facts mixed up. I just read the book, but I think that's how it went down. He said one time he went backstage and Tommy Lee, who's known for a few things, but he was with a groupie who was pleasuring him, and Tommy Lee was just like, "Hey Ozzy, come over here, sit next to me, she'll take care of you afterwards." And the way Ozzy put it was so hilarious. He's like, I looked down and I was like, "Tommy, you got a license for that thing?" And he's like, "I'm not sitting next to you, man. That would be like a tugboat pulling up next to the Titanic." I almost had to pull over laughing because I was listening to it on audiobook. He goes into the whole satanic panic era, which I did a whole video for. I can link it at the bottom because it includes a lot of Ozzy stuff. But he talked about how there's press conferences and he was accused of being responsible for some teenager offing themselves. And it was a dark time. And the press would just grill him. One time a guy was like, "Well, if you listen to the lyrics of Paranoid, aren't you saying, 'I tell you to end your life, I wish I could, but it's too late'?" And then the rest of the press were yelling over the top of that. So Ozzy never got to answer. So it sounded really bad. Ozzy's like, "No, it's enjoy life. Enjoy life, not end your life." But I could see how they could make that mistake. It sounds kind of the same. Ozzy briefly mentions the other guitar players that were in his band. I'm sure he could write a lot more about each one, but he kind of skims through them. For all the things that he took as far as drugs and alcohol, I'm surprised he remembers anything. He talked about how Zakk Wylde's first gig was actually in a prison. And as they were setting up, a whole bunch of these inmates were like catcalling Zakk because he had flowing blonde hair and he was real skinny at the time. And that must have been terrifying. Your first gig with Ozzy and you're in a freaking prison. After all the partying, Ozzy was afraid that he may have caught some diseases, and so he went to the doctor to get an AIDS test. And back then, that was basically a death sentence if it came back positive. Well, he took the test, and he had to wait a few weeks for the results, and when they came back, the doctor was like, "Sorry, turns out you have it," and Ozzy just almost fell to the floor. He thought he had it. He thought he'd give it to Sharon. He was just devastated. But then the doctor got a phone call, and it turns out it was just inconclusive because Ozzy's immune system was so shot from all his partying that they thought he may have had AIDS. You would think that would be rock bottom for Ozzy, but it wasn't. A few of the parts of the book are a bummer to read about because you're really not sure who's being truthful because, there's all this litigation stuff flying around, and there was a time when Ozzy or Sharon had the first two albums re-recorded, at least the bass and the drums. Because originally you had Bob Daisley on bass and writing credits for the songs, and then you had Lee Kerslake on drums. And with Randy Rhoads and Ozzy, that is the core of the first iteration of Ozzy's solo career. Early on, they blamed Ozzy for wanting to do the re-recordings, but in Ozzy's Autobiography, he says that it was actually Sharon's idea. And even though the re-recordings are done well, it's Robert Trujillo, I can never say his last name, and Mike Borden from Faith No More, they cut those tracks, they recut them, and you could tell they worked really hard on getting it very close, but it's just not the same. You're used to the original. So that was in 2002. And then Ozzy ended up, canning that whole idea, and he went back to the original recordings. But it really sucks when you listen to videos from Bob and Lee talking about what really went down. You're just like, man, who's telling the truth here? There was one part of the book where he talks about going crazy because his wife Thelma at the time bought him a bunch of chickens, and she constantly bothered him about feeding them all the time. And so he ended up shooting all the chickens, and there was one time where he actually got rid of a whole family of cats that were infesting, I guess, his garage, he said. And Ozzy's a weird dude. He would collect some crazy memorabilia, and I talked about this a little bit before, but he was buying guns, and he would just lose his mind and just become very violent when it came to certain things. And sadly, animals were often on the receiving end of his rage. That's what makes the Osbournes so weird, because they have so many animals in the house. They had like 15 dogs, and they had cats and birds words and everything. But early on, that was a dangerous thing to have around Ozzy. It was really interesting to hear about Ozzy's mom because it turns out, for most of their lives, they were very poor. So when Ozzy became successful, a lot of the times when they were together, she would talk about money a lot. And there was one time where I believe Ozzy was being slandered in the newspaper and his mom was mentioned in it. So she ended up trying to get a retraction from the newspaper plus $45,000 in order to not sue them. So she ended up getting that money, and Ozzy was kind of hurt by that because he just wanted the whole thing to go away, but his mom kept bringing it up for some reason, and it turns out it's because she was trying to get that money. And then before she passed away, her last questions to Ozzy were, "Are you a millionaire?" And Ozzy's like, "Yes, Mom, I'm a millionaire." And then her eyes got really big, I guess, and she's like, "Are you a multi-millionaire?" And he's like, "Yes, Mom, I am." And then she looked really happy, and then she ended up passing away shortly after that. So it's kind of strange how that was such a big thing to her. But I guess if you spend your life dirt poor, that stuff, becomes very important. But Ozzy wanted his mom to be proud of him for other things, not just how much he made. And there was one time where they went to the house of Roger Whittaker, who was like this kind of easy listening artist. And Ozzy had to go to the bathroom because earlier that day he took some sort of colon cleanse juice or something. And so he used the bathroom and there was no toilet paper. So he ended up using the drapes in the bathroom. He had no idea what to do with them. So he ended up crumpling them and throwing them in the bathtub. So that sounds like a typical Ozzy story. I guess he would purposely injure himself in order to get prescriptions for certain pills, namely Vicodin. I think he said he was taking like 28 pills a day. And one time in Germany, he was so numb that he fell between the bed and the wall and he couldn't move his body to get out of there. So he was stuck in that position for 5 hours. That story gave me a little claustrophobia. He decided to retire after his No More Tours tour, which I got to go to, thankfully. It was great. And I guess he just got bored, like a lot of rockers do. And he started thinking about it. He's like, you know what? I could still rock. And I don't have a boss. I'm pretty much my own boss. Well, Sharon as well. And he realized that he missed playing out. So he decided to unretire, which all the rock stars seem to do. Well, right around that time, Lollapalooza was a big deal. And Sharon tried to get Ozzy on that, but they kind of laughed at them. They're like, "Ozzy, he's ancient news, So Sharon's like, "Screw you. I'm going to make my own show." And they created Ozzfest after that, which, as you know, was huge. So they did a good job showing Lollapalooza up. Well, that's when they had the idea to have the original Black Sabbath get together to headline it. And Bill Ward tried, but his health just wasn't up for it. He ended up having like a heart attack during rehearsals. And the band thought he was kidding. Like he was trying to get back at them for, pranking on him all those years. But turns out it was real. The Osbournes eventually came to be, and it started off with some shorter versions of that. They had like a Cribs episode on MTV, I guess. And it was so popular that MTV's like, "How about a whole show for you guys?" And I guess at first, it was exciting and Ozzy liked it, but then he quickly got tired of it. But the response was so huge, they just had to keep going. So they had multiple seasons. And that's when the whole world basically got to know Ozzy Osbourne. Up until then, he was always this mysterious metal guy, this metal legend. But all of a sudden, he was going to the store and like teenage girls were running up to him and being like, "Ozzy." Even though he was so popular, he would still get starstruck. And I remember seeing a video where he met Paul McCartney, and he was a huge fan of the Beatles ever since the very beginning. He said that that's what really made him want to do music. And so it's funny watching this video where he's kind of, bashful around Paul McCartney. And it made me think no matter how big you get as an artist, there's still a bigger fish, if you will. They got a letter from Bill Cosby sort of, chastising them for swearing so much on the Osbournes. And Sharon wrote back and she's like, "You know what? People in glass houses should not throw stones," I think she said. She's like, "What we do is nothing compared to what you've been accused of, And then I guess Bill Cosby wrote back and apologized. Ozzy went in for a colonoscopy, and I guess it took 4 times as much Demerol as it takes a normal human being to be put under. And the doctor was just freaking out because he's like, "Why aren't you out? We just gave you 3 doses of this stuff." But around that time, Sharon found out that she had an issue. And so she was doing all the stuff, chemo and everything. And one time to cheer her up, Ozzy hired Robin Williams to come over because I think he watched Patch Adams and he wanted him to do that sort of thing for Sharon. And I thought, that's how you know you're in the money, when you can hire Robin freaking Williams to come over. I recall this happening a long time ago, but I didn't know how severe the ATV accident was. So Ozzy was out just scooting around. I think it was on a four-wheeler, and he crashed and he broke his neck. And that was sort of the start of the domino effect of his health just deteriorating. And that'll do it. During this time, he had released a song with his daughter Kelly, who had, a singing career for a while. And they did a version of Changes, which I guess went to #1. I never knew that. That's kind of cool. And Ozzy said that he was kind of sad during that time because his, bandmates in Black Sabbath never called to #1, see how he was doing health-wise, or to congratulate him for, having a #1 single with his daughter. There was another time where Ozzy went up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, and he caught a burglar, stealing, I guess, $2 million worth of jewelry, I think. So Ozzy, I think he was naked, put the guy in a headlock, and they're right next to a window. And Ozzy decided just to throw him out the window, because he didn't want anything else to happen. And I thought, how crazy would that be? You're going to rob Ozzy Osbourne in the middle of the night. You end up running into him, he's naked, and he puts you in a freaking headlock and throws you out a window. That's another part I just cracked up at. But I guess Ozzy said rock bottom was actually when he was in a hotel room with Zakk Wylde. And he was like, something I never did? I never threw a TV out a hotel window, which is something all rock stars seem to want to do. So he eventually did it, but it was a huge disaster, and he ended up being fined $50,000 for his craziness. And that's when he decided, you know what, I'm done with all this stuff. I'm not going to do the rock star thing anymore. So that was kind of his rock bottom. When this book was being made, they were talking about, they didn't really know who owned the name Black Sabbath. So they're still sort of in litigation about that. I don't think it was anything really aggressive. But I looked it up today, and it turns out that he and Tony Iommi own the name Black Sabbath. So I think Geezer and Bill just sort of like, whatever, take the name. At the very end, he talks about dying, and I thought, wow, this is crazy because he's still like 16 years from actually passing away when he wrote this. But he's like, I asked them not to cremate me, but to bury me in some sort of garden, hopefully one that, grows like, crab apples so that you guys can make wine out of me and, maybe have a toast for me. I think he said that part about a toast. I may have made that up. But it was really weird to read that part knowing now that he had passed away, because it's like, man, I wonder if they followed through. And I believe they buried him in his own yard, basically. And I think it was next to a garden. So I think he got his wish. I'm not sure about the crab apple tree, though. All right, everyone. Thank you for watching. I'm going to cut probably a lot of these out of my YouTube version of the video because it's just going to be a long video. But I'll put the entire thing with all of these points on my Patreon version, I believe. Yes. So if you end up signing up for $5 a month, there's no commercials, and you'll get, sometimes extended versions of my videos. So we'll see you there. Okay, everyone. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you later. Bye-bye.